On April 2, 1982, under General Leopoldo Gattalieri's military junta, Argentine forces invaded Falklands Island, situated just 310 miles off Argentina's coast and twice the distance from Antarctica. With the discovery attributed to Magellan in the 1500s, the Falklands history could be described as a battleground of the symbolic colonial rivalry. In 1765, two settlements appeared simultaneously, one by British Captain John Byron on the western side, and another by French explorer Louis-Antoine de Bougainville on the east. Just a year later, complications arose. Byron claimed the islands for Britain, citing an earlier visit 70 years before by John Strong, while Bougainville, in true French pragmatism, sold its settlements to Spain under Pacte de Famille, as Spaniards sought to protect its South American zone of influence from French colonial aspirations. The mess didn't simplify from there. In 1774, Britain, trained by the American War of Independence, withdrew its forces from the South Atlantic but left behind a plaque asserting sovereignty, a small metal marker with outside historical significance. Nearly half a century later, in 1820, following Argentina's independence, the islands were declared Argentinian territory as part of the new republic's inheritance from the defeated Spaniards. Consequently, by 1833, Britain recalled its lone plaque as grounds to reassert their Falklands claim, dispatching a single warship and ousting a modest Argentinian presence of 12 soldiers. Over the next 150 years, the Falklands remained largely insignificant, a remote outpost whose population grew from 200 to just over 3,000, sustained by fishing and sheep farming, with no valuable natural resources or strategic geopolitical location, mostly known for two visits of Charles Darwin in the 19th century. Yet, as encapsulated by Victor Bailey, professor of modern British history at the University of Canvas, by the 1970s, both Argentina and Britain, grappling with internal crisis, saw the potential of utilizing the century-long dispute over some sheep as a way to rebuild their domestic stances, framing the Falklands as a symbol of their national sovereignty. By the early 1980s, Britain was mired in one of the most severe economic and social crises since the Great Depression. Unemployment had surpassed 3 million, climbing to 10.4% of the population by 1982. In 5 years, between 1975 and 1980, inflation peaked at staggering 24.2%, briefly fell to 8.3%, and rebounded to 18%. The 1979 oil shocks, which doubled oil prices worldwide, led to soaring energy bills and deepened economic stagnation in an industrial economy heavily reliant on oil imports for heating and transportation. For Margaret Thatcher, who had been leading the Conservative Party at the time and became Britain's first female Prime Minister in 1979, the crisis presented the most challenging test of domestic leadership since World War II. Her government responded with aggressive austerity measures, later defined as neoliberal, cutting public spending by £4 billion in the 1980s, reducing unemployment benefits, local housing subsidies, funding of state schools, higher education, and local councils. Further, industries such as coal, steel, and shipbuilding were labeled as unprofitable and required to shift from being state-owned to standing on their own. Consequently, the industrial sector, already struggling with outdated technology and stiff competition from modernized economies like Germany and Japan, bore the brand of new policies, aimed at transitioning Britain towards a service-based economy which prioritized finance, banking, and consumer services, not manufacturing. Thus, between 1979 and 1981, over 17,000 factories announced closure, exacerbating fierce opposition to the government's actions through protests and strikes, which had begun during the winter of discontent in 1978, still under Labour's leadership. Thatcher's response, however, was equally uncompromising. The 1979 Trade Union Act required the majority of union members to ballot for supporting strikes, imposing fines, and seizing assets for unsuccessful attempts. This led to a decline in working days lost to strikes from 29.5 million in 1979 to just over 4.3 million by 1982, but also fueled resentment of Thatcher's stance in the country. On the other side of the Atlantic, Argentina was also grappling with crisis. In 1976, a military junta known as the National Reorganization Process overthrew a democratically elected socialist government and established a brutal dictatorship strongly funded by the US. Consolidating the power, the regime waged the infamous Dirty War, during which an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 political dissidents were forcibly arrested by the government forces, never to be seen again. Economically, the junta reliance on printing money to finance fiscal deficits resulted in inflation soaring about 130% by 1982, while the regime's heavy borrowing, primarily from the International Monetary Fund, to fund military expenditures drove the country's foreign debt to $35 billion, equivalent to today's GDP of countries like Morocco or Kuwait. Between 1976 and 1982, Argentina's industrial production declined by over 20%, leading to the closure of more than 3,000 factories, exacerbating unemployment to around 5% and resulting in urban poverty in cities like Buenos Aires exceeding 30% of the population. Consequently, as the public dissatisfaction with the junta regime grew, General Gattalieri saw the Falklands dispute as an opportunity to channel national sentiments and distract the population from the country's domestic crisis. Declassified documents from the Falklands Crisis 1982 folder, released in 2008, revealed that Galtieri's interpreted Britain's 1976 Defense Review, which decommissioned the HMS Endurance, the Royal Navy's sole Antarctic patrol vessel, as a signal that Britain had lost strategic interest in the South Atlantic. Further, despite British diplomats assuring Argentina of their commitments to Falklands, Galtieri believed that domestic economic struggles and high oil transportation costs required to retaliate would deter Britain from responding to an attack. Additionally, believing in US neutrality in the conflict due to ties with the Reagan administration, a vital ally in the Cold War battle against leftist insurgencies in Latin America, Galtieri ordered an invasion of the islands while amplifying populist anti-colonialist rhetoric in Argentine media. However, the Argentinian leader underestimated that Margaret Thatcher's government, just like him at the time, was politically vulnerable and looking for a chance. And that just like him, she recognized that reasserting sovereignty over the Falklands offered an opportunity to restore British pride and project global strength, boosting her domestic public approval. On April 2, 1982, within hours of Argentina's invasion, Thatcher convened her war cabinet consisting of key figures such as deputy prime ministers, secretaries of defense and foreign affairs, and the chief of defense staff. Notably absent, per Thatcher's request, was representation from Her Majesty's Treasury, an internal part of the British government following advice from former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who warned that financial objections from the royal family, had they surfaced the public, could compromise public support for military actions and dominate headlines with speculative Queen's opposition narratives. On the same day, Thatcher publicly rejected any notion of negotiation, 3 days later asserting,
"We have to recover those islands. We have to recover them, for the people on them are British, of British stock, and they still owe allegiance to the Crown and want to be British. We have to do what is necessary to recover those islands."
Earlier that day, Thatcher ordered the deployment of a British task force initiating Operation Corporate, mobilizing a fleet of 127 vessels, comprising 44 warships, 22 Royal Fleet auxiliaries, and merchant ships carrying over 28,000 military personnel. Among them, 2 aircraft carriers, HMS Hermes and Invincible, equipped with over 20 Sea Harrier jets. Despite the logistical challenge of the fleet traversing over 13,000 kilometers from Portsmouth to the South Atlantic, requiring resupply missions under threat of attack on the way, that overwhelming display of power dwarfed Argentina's estimated 10,000-strong force, primarily made of poorly trained conscripts. The first major escalation occurred on May 2, 1982, a month into the war, when the British nuclear-powered submarine HMS Conqueror sank the Argentine cruiser Ariel General Belgrano. The controversial strike outside the declared exclusion zone resulted in the deaths of 323 Argentine sailors and neutralized Argentina's naval threat. Endorsed directly by Thatcher, the decision sent a clear message about the resolve of her government regarding the Argentinian invasion.
It is important that aggression does not succeed. We've seen enough of it already. If this one succeeds, there'll be other examples of it elsewhere. We must go out calmly, quietly, to succeed.
Argentina retaliated 2 days later, deploying French-made missiles to sink the British destroyer HMS Sheffield, claiming the lives of 20 British crew members, sparking a domestic debate on the follies of lives lost. Yet, despite the frequent Argentinian attacks with 62 sorties launched on average, British Sea Harrier jets achieved an extraordinary 20-0 kill ratio, ensuring air dominance, while the successful British amphibious assaults in San Carlos Bay, the Battle of Goose Green, and Battle of Mount Tumbledown, resulting in deaths of 17 British troops and surrender of 200 Argentine soldiers, forced Argentina's defense break and subsequent formal surrender on the 74th day of the conflict. The war's total loss: 349 Argentine soldiers, 255 British servicemen, and 3 Falkland civilians. The victory spied a wave of national pride across Britain, amplified by the media jubilant headlines dominated the press. The Sun mentioned "Rejoice, rejoice," the Daily Mail celebrated "The Empire Strikes Back," and the Daily Express hailed "Our proudest day." Meanwhile, some publications offered more critical reflections, like The Guardian asking, "War won, but at what cost?" For Thatcher, however, the victory marked a pivotal political moment. Her approval ratings, which plummeted to 28% in March 1982 amidst domestic turmoil, soared to 51% on the days of the war's conclusion. This surge set the stage for her Conservative Party's landslide victory in the 1983 general elections a year later, where they secured 362 out of 523 seats and 144-seat majority, with 42.2% of the national vote. The Falklands War hence not only restored Britain's global status, but also solidified Thatcher's image as a decisive leader willing to defend British sovereignty at all cost.
Yet, despite the surge in Thatcher's approval ratings, Britain's deep structural economic challenges remain unresolved. By 1984, unemployment had peaked at 11.8%, the highest since World War II, with a growing divide between Southeast England's emerging customer-driven economy and the industrial decline in Northwest England, Scotland, and Wales. Thatcher's 1983 re-election campaign drew sharp contrast with her predecessors, including Conservative Edward Heath and Labourist Harold Wilson and James Callaghan, whose adherence to Keynesian economics had continued British economic policy standards since World War II, which emphasized active government intervention to stabilize the economy, yet led to a cycle of stagnation and inefficiency. Wage and price controls designed to curb inflation failed to address the deeper structural issues underlying British competitiveness. The structural issues included outdated manufacturing, unable to compete with other growing economies, the global oil stocks in 1973 and 1979, and resistance from powerful trade unions to which politicians had to adhere to maintain their public approval. For example, the price caps led to artificial limits on goods and services, causing shortages and reducing profitability as businesses' spending rose while their sales declined, further reducing investment from international cooperations. As a result, the comparable purchase parity had weakened, which added to inflation instead of limiting it. Nationalization pursued to preserve jobs and fill industries like coal, steel, and shipbuilding proved equally problematic. By 1976, nearly 10% of the British workforce was employed in state-owned enterprises. And by 1979, government subsidies to these industries totaled over £3 billion annually, equal to 1.4% of the GDP. To put this into perspective, the auspices were nearly a third of its health services expenditures. Yet the subsidies, largely substantiated by Thatcher's predecessors, complying with powerful labor unions' advocacy to increase them, only maintained the existence of inefficient enterprises unable to compete internationally. Meanwhile, welfare spending doubled as a share of GDP from 5% in 1970 to 9% in 1979, twice as much as the country's military, healthcare, or education spending at the time. With programs like child benefits introduced in 1977, unemployment aid, and housing benefits for low-income families accounting for approximately 45% of all program spending. While intended to reduce poverty and provide a safety net for the unemployed, they strained public finances at the time, when tax revenues were declining due to widespread job losses in manufacturing, creating a negative reinforcing spending loop. Throughout the 1970s, Britain's budget deficit averaged 4% of the GDP, and national debt surged to 43% of GDP, causing Britain to dramatically seek a $3.9 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund in 1976, the largest in IMF's history at the time. Thatcher's critique of these predecessor policies was rooted in her belief that Britain's economic woes stemmed from an over-reliance on government intervention. For decades, both Labourists and Conservatives had followed a post-war social welfare consensus that sought to guarantee access to basic needs like healthcare, housing, and pension. These services were scarce after World War II, yet the system was outdated by the early 1980s. It was well-intended, but for Thatcher, this view fostered dependency and stifled individual responsibility and innovation. Her opposition extended to Keynesian economics itself, as she saw advocating for government spending to stimulate growth during economic downturns as a dangerous feedback loop. Increasing public spending during decline led to rising deficits, further constraining the state's ability to invest in long-term growth. Consequently, her new neoliberal philosophy emphasized reducing the state's role in the economy, promoting individual responsibility and unleashing market forces to drive competitiveness and progress. During her famous Conservative Party conference speech, 1983, half a year after the Falklands War, she articulated,
"Let us never forget this fundamental truth. The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. And it's no good thinking that someone else will pay. That someone else is you. There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money.
Recognizing the need for a broader ideological shift, back in 1974, Thatcher, alongside Keith Joseph, established the Center for Policy Studies, CPS, a think tank aimed at fostering market-oriented policies and reshaping conservative thought. The CPS provided a crucial intellectual and critical foundation for Thatcher's neoliberal vision, emphasizing individual freedom, reduced government intervention, and free market-driven economy. It published research papers and case studies, organized seminars, drafted policy recommendations, and, importantly, became a training ground for future conservative leaders, ensuring that Thatcher's and Joseph's ideas would be carried forward. After the strong public approval wave following the 1982 Falklands War and the absolute majority achieved in the 1983 elections, Thatcher found herself in a powerful position. She had strong internal government support, as her appointees were often former members of the CPS. With a public perception of her as someone who had restored the British economy and strengthened its international standing, she was finally able to implement the neoliberal policy changes developed within the CPS framework without facing significant domestic opposition. Perhaps one of the clearest examples of Thatcher's changes was the Social Security Act of 1986, which overhauled the British pension system, which initially consisted of three components. Firstly, the basic state pension, a government-managed contribution-based system funded by mandatory national insurance contributions, NICs, from employers and employees. Secondly, the State Earnings-Related Pension Scheme, SERPS, an optional supplement that allowed individuals to contribute additional NICs for higher pension payouts. And finally, the occupational pensions, private schemes where employers and employees jointly contributed to a fund that grew over time and was accessed upon retirement. For Thatcher's cabinet, a key weakness of the first two was their dependency on current workers' contributions in order to fund retirees' pensions. When the numbers of contributors fell or costs outpaced contributions due to unemployment, it would cause the government to cover the shortfall, placing an immense strain on public finances. In 1979, it accounted for a total spending comparable to approximately 1% of Britain's GDP, exceeding the cost spent on transportation by 50%. The Act of 1986 made significant adjustments to the SERPS, including the reduction of benefits from 25 to 20% of an individual's average lifetime earnings and stricter eligibility criteria introduced regarding the length of required employment, and introduction of rebates on NICs by providing bonus payments for those who opted out of the SERPS. It incentivized transition away from the state-managed pension. Thus, the Act, one of the first major revolutions of Britain's economic policies, embodies the tenets of neoliberalism which Thatcher advocated for. It reduced state dependency, it advocated for market-based solutions, and emphasized individual autonomy. Representing a radical departure from the post-war social welfare consensus, such policies redefined the role of the British state, transitioning it from a caretaker to a facilitator. It emphasized individual responsibility, market competition, and fiscal discipline, principles that now firmly define our legacy and continue to shape Britain's service-based economic identity. Yet, these decisions, controversial, radical, and unyielding, were made possible through the legitimacy Thatcher earned during the Falklands War. That victory not only restored national pride, long diminished in post-World War II Britain, but also transformed Thatcher's public image, aligning her resolute leadership with the reclamation of British sovereignty and global impact. It was this victory that bolstered her political authority, culminating in the 1983 parliamentary dominance that enabled her to implement her neoliberal agenda, including landmark policies like the Social Security Act in 1986. These reforms, rooted in Thatcher's signature leadership style, confidence underpinned by meticulous preparation and a readiness to act decisively, even in the face of opposition, exemplified by the foundational work of the CPS, is what is today defined as Thatcherism. And while particular causal mechanisms can be debated, whether the Falklands War is remembered as a necessary assertion of sovereignty or as a tragic loss of innocent lives, and whether Thatcher's neoliberal reforms are celebrated for fostering competitiveness or critiqued for their social cost or impact on Britain's identity in the 20th century is undeniable. Through her strategic alliances, particularly with the Reagan administration, Thatcher not only reshaped Britain but also influenced the global adoption of neoliberalism, a legacy that persists today, from Brexit's emphasis on sovereignty to China's embrace of market-driven reforms. Thank you for listening. Kacper, Lawrence, and Baroness Margaret Thatcher.
Are we going to declare war on Argentina, Mrs. Thatcher?
Rejoice.